The first thing Overseer Drathvel noticed about the human was her hands. Not her eyes, though those were unsettling enough. Those wet, forward-facing organs that caught light like something perpetually startled. Not her voice, though it would become a problem. It was the hands. Specifically, the way she held them while the processing crew fitted the compliance band around her wrist, thumbs tucked inward, fingers loose, the posture of a creature that had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of patience. Drathvel had catalogued 47 species through this intake corridor in his 9 cycles of service. He had never seen anything hold still the way she did. Not resigned, not broken, not even particularly afraid. Just waiting, like a spring wound so tight the coiling had become invisible. Her designation, per the acquisition manifest, was Maren Coyle. Species, human. Point of origin, Earth. Third planet, Sol system. A middling yellow star in a backwater spiral arm. Nobody had paid serious attention to until about 60 years ago, when a Veth scout ship had done a routine sweep and come back with the sort of readings that made cartographers sit up very straight in their chairs. Biosphere rich, resources adequate. Dominant species, bipedal, carbon-based, distressingly short-lived, apparently not possessed of interstellar capability, but demonstrating what the field report diplomatically called aberrant cognitive flexibility. Diplomatic language. Drathvel had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather. Not for what it says, but for what it carefully avoids. She'd been brought aboard the hierarchical vessel Dominion of Correct Order as part of a labor acquisition following the formal annexation of Earth's northern administrative territories. Standard procedure. The Veth Collective's expansion protocols were, if nothing else, thorough. You took a sampling of the labor-capable population. You assigned them tasks commensurate with their biological specifications. You issued directives through the compliance architecture, and the band on their wrist ensured they followed those directives or experienced increasing levels of neurostimulus correction until they did. Simple. Elegant. It had worked on 43 species. 43. Maren Coyle looked down at the compliance band, the way you might look at a parking ticket. Mildly annoyed, already thinking past it. Acquisition Coyle. The processing clerk. A young Veth named Sithran, still growing his secondary crest. Still too eager, addressed her in the translated frequency. You have been assigned to the Environmental Maintenance Division. Your duties include atmospheric filtration monitoring, hull integrity sweeps in sections 7 through 12, and distribution of nutrition packs to labor units in dormitory clusters B through F. You will receive your directives each morning cycle via the compliance architecture. You will complete them. You will not deviate. Do you understand? She looked at him. Sure, she said. Sithran made a notation. Drathvel, watching from the observation deck above, felt the first faint flicker of something he would not identify for another 3 weeks. He catalogued it incorrectly as mild professional interest. The Dominion of Correct Order was not a cruel ship. Exactly. Drathvel had served on cruel ships' vessels where the overseers used the compliance bands recreationally, where the labor units were kept just below the threshold of function, where productivity suffered because someone up the chain of command had confused fear with efficiency. The Dominion was not that. It was simply indifferent, which, as it turned out, was its own kind of problem. The Veth Collective operated on the principle of hierarchical inevitability. Every organism had a position. Every position had a function. Every function had an optimal execution, and optimal execution was best achieved through precise instruction. The compliance bands were not punishment. They were splied, and the collective was very clear on this guidance. A correction mechanism. Like bumpers on a hover lane, keeping labor units from drifting into inefficiency. This framing had always made perfect sense to Drathvel. Maren Coyle, apparently, had a different set of bumpers. Her first 3 days were unremarkable. She completed her tasks. She monitored the filtration nodes, swept the hull sections, distributed nutrition packs with what the daily logs recorded as acceptable efficiency. No compliance corrections issued. Sithran, who was responsible for logging labor unit performance in her division, submitted reports that contained phrases like "within expected parameters" and "no anomalies noted." Drathvel read them every morning as part of his standard oversight duties and moved on. It was on the 4th day that she started talking to the other labor units. Not loudly, not in a way that triggered the ambient monitoring flags for incitement or sedition. She talked the way people talk when they are standing in line at a grocery store, just filling the air with something human, chatting with the Kethar twins who ran the atmospheric scrubbers, asking the old Primath named Vessel something unpronounceable about his back. He had a bad back, it turned out, had had it for years, and nobody had ever asked. Coaxing 3 syllables out of the famously uncommunicative Gorlan who worked the overnight filtration shift and reportedly had not spoken to anyone in 8 months. The Gorlan's name, she discovered, was Tell. Just Tell, he told her, surprised at himself for saying it, and she said, "Nice to meet you, Tell," as though this were an ordinary thing, as though names still mattered here, as though the act of calling something by its own name instead of its designation number was not, in the architecture of the Dominion of Correct Order, a minor revolution. Drath Vel noticed because he noticed everything. 31 years in the Oversight Division had given him an eye for pattern, and the pattern emerging in Environmental Maintenance Division 7 was not technically wrong. Nothing she was doing violated the directives. She completed her tasks. She completed them, in fact, at a rate approximately 11% above standard efficiency benchmarks, which the system flagged as a green indicator. The conversations she had with other labor units took place during designated rest intervals. The compliance architecture had no directive against talking. Nobody had thought to write one. He pulled her full acquisition file. Standard intake data, biometrics, estimated useful service lifespan, 20 to 30 years, generous for a human, and at the bottom, a secondary field that most overseers never read because it dealt with species-level behavioral data, dry stuff, academic. He read it. Homo sapiens, the field said, demonstrate a behavioral pattern classified by xenopsychologists as hierarchical inversion tendency. Unlike most acquired species, whose social structures reinforce obedience to established authority, H. sapiens appear to have evolved in competitive environments that selected for a paradoxical trait. The highest social status is assigned not to those who command most effectively, but to those who render command structures unnecessary by compelling voluntary compliance in others. In practice, this means H. sapiens individuals frequently comply with directives while simultaneously restructuring the social environment around them in ways that shift the actual locus of authority. Overseers are advised to monitor for this pattern, particularly in individuals demonstrating above-average cognitive assessment scores. Maren Coyle's cognitive assessment score was in the 94th percentile. Drath Vel sat with this information for a long time. Long enough that his secondary crest, a physiological indicator of cognitive engagement that older Vel learned to suppress in professional settings, rose almost imperceptibly above baseline. He pressed it flat with one careful hand and returned to his reports. He did not alert his superiors. He wasn't sure why. Later, he would tell himself it was because there was nothing technically to report. Later still, he would admit that wasn't quite true. The first real incident happened 3 weeks in, and it happened, of all places, in the Nutrition Distribution Queue. Environmental Maintenance Division 7 shared a distribution window with Mechanical Repair Division 3, which meant twice daily, a crowd of 60-plus labor units from various species shuffled through a narrow corridor to receive their ration packs. The system was designed for throughput, not comfort. Labor units were expected to collect their packs, move through, disperse. The Veth supervisor assigned to the window, a minor functionary named Peldor, had a habit of issuing compliance corrections to any unit he felt was moving too slowly. Not egregiously, not cruelly, just the baseline buzz, a 2-second neurological nudge. Standard stuff. Maren Coyle watched this for 3 weeks. Drath Vel watched her watch it. He'd flagged her movements for monitoring after the behavioral file notation, more out of habit than anything he'd articulate as concern. He watched her in the corridors, in the maintenance bays, at the distribution window. He watched her take her ration pack from Peldor each morning without comment, step to the side of the corridor, and eat standing up rather than moving to the designated consumption area, which meant she was still there when the labor units behind her came through. Just present. In the way that certain kinds of people are more present than others, a quality that has nothing to do with size or volume and everything to do with where the attention goes. On day 22, Peldor issued a correction to an elderly Cathar female named Mira Shess, who had been moving slowly through the queue because she was carrying extra ration packs for 2 units in her section who were too ill to collect their own. Standard correction. 2 seconds, sufficient to make Mira Shess stumble, drop half the packs, look at the floor with the expression of something that has been reminded once again that it is a thing and not a person. Maren Coyle said very calmly, "Peldor." Everyone in the corridor went quiet. Not dramatic movie quiet, just the particular quality of silence that falls when something unexpected happens, and the air hasn't decided yet what it means. Peldor turned. Acquisition coil. Move along. Mira Chess was carrying ration distribution for Units 7-2B and 7F, who are logged sick this cycle. I checked this morning's health report. A beat. Not aggressive, not defiant, just informational. She was performing an authorized secondary function. The compliance correction was applied to a unit engaged in authorized labor. This was technically accurate. Drathvel confirmed it from his console in approximately 4 seconds, because he had been watching and had already pulled the health logs the moment he saw where this was going. Peldor knew it was accurate too. He could see it in the way his secondary crest flickered. An involuntary tell. Move along, he said again, but the authority had gone out of it, the way air goes out of something punctured. Maren Coyle picked up the dropped ration packs from the floor, handed them back to Mira Chess, and moved along. Nothing about what she'd done was technically prohibited. She had cited an authorized regulation, provided accurate information, and then complied with the order to move. The compliance band hadn't even registered a blip, but in the 60-plus labor units who witnessed it, something had moved. Not loudly, not in a way that would show up on a flag report, just the shift of a tide that had been building quietly under the surface, that had needed, possibly, only someone to name where the current was. Peldor submitted a complaint to Drathvel that afternoon. It was poorly written and contained 3 factual inaccuracies. Drathvel sent it back with the errors marked, that night alone in his observation quarters, which were comfortable because he had earned them, which overlooked a viewport that showed the slow wheel of a star system they were passing through, which contained a small collection of text files he'd accumulated over the years, reports and field studies and the odd piece of academic xenobiology that he read the way other Veth watched recreational feeds. Drathvel pulled up the behavioral file again. Hierarchical inversion tendency, he read. He thought about the way she'd said Peldor's name. Not shouted, not challenged, just named, the way you might name a thing you have decided to understand. He closed the file. He sat in the dark for a while with the starlight coming in silver across the floor. He thought, this is going to be a problem. He thought, I don't think I'm going to stop it. He wasn't sure which of those thoughts disturbed him more. Over the following 6 weeks, Maren Coyle did not lead a rebellion. She organized a maintenance schedule. That's the honest way to describe it. And he'd spent a lot of time since trying to find a less damning description, and he kept coming back to this one because it was accurate. She noticed somewhere in week 4 that the Environmental Maintenance Division's workflow had 3 redundant inspection loops that were wasting approximately 4 hours of collective labor per cycle and delaying hull integrity reports by an average of 90 minutes. She mentioned this to her immediate Veth supervisory clerk. Not Sith Ran this time. His rotation had moved him to a different section, but a clerk named Ashvel who was, by Drathvel's internal assessment, competent enough but not particularly creative. Ashvel looked at the workflow analysis Maren had drawn out on a piece of maintenance log parchment using a stylus sheet obtained from somewhere. He studied it. He implemented 2 of the 3 suggested changes because the third involved a realignment of the reporting hierarchy in a way that made him uneasy, even though she demonstrated clearly it was more efficient. 2 things happened as a result. The hull integrity reports came in on time for the first time in 8 months, which generated a commendation for Ashvel from the section commander, and Maren Coyle, per Ashvel's subsequent performance notation, was flagged as demonstrating unusual initiative, appropriate for consideration for elevated task classification. Elevated task classification meant access to more of the ship. Drathvel read this notation at 0300 ship time, woke himself the rest of the way up with stimulant tea, and spent a long time looking at the viewport. He could override it. He had the authority. Overseers existed precisely to apply judgment where the compliance architecture's automated flags couldn't. He could annotate Ashvel's notation, recommend against the elevation, note the behavioral file flag and let the system handle it. He didn't do that either. The thing was, and he kept returning to this, kept turning it over like a stone with something interesting underneath. Nothing she was doing was wrong. The efficiency improvements were real. The compliance corrections issued to labor units in her section had dropped by 31% since her arrival, which the automated productivity system classified as a positive indicator. The old primath with the bad back had been quietly moved, per a suggestion she'd made to Ashvel which he'd passed up the chain as his own idea, to a less physically demanding station. Tal the Gorlan, who had not spoken to anyone in 8 months, was now talking to 3 people. Miraches brought her an extra ration on the mornings when the distribution window was short on protein packs, which meant she was tracking the supply chain well enough to anticipate shortages. Intelligence that, had any Veth administrator bothered to apply it, would have streamlined ordering considerably. None of this was sedition. None of it was technically insubordination. She followed every directive issued through her compliance band, on time, within acceptable parameters. She was just also, quietly, implacably, building something. Drath Vel had studied enough species to have a vocabulary for what he was watching, even if the vocabulary didn't sit comfortably in Veth linguistic structures. The closest analog he could construct was something from an academic paper he'd read once, a comparative social dynamics study from before the annexation, from an Earth anthropologist of all people, a researcher who had died, he thought, before the acquisition, whose papers had been catalogued as part of the standard resource sweep. She had written about what she called distributed authority, the way human societies frequently evolved leadership structures that looked horizontal but functioned through networks of obligation and trust rather than command and correction. He'd read it as an interesting footnote, an academic curiosity about a pre-space flight species. He was reading it differently now. Min John and Tora tended wodonim to be with the dew with our tola to Toledo's felf. One the paw tola futs, Nanthe luna where's you the wo I come tola fofs to our come tola fof tolaf. Oh, one the paw tolaf, dari jor will be choro. He was reading it at a 0300 ship time in stimulant T-assisted clarity as a field manual, and Maren Coyle was on Chapter 4. The compliance band on her wrist had not issued a single correction in 47 days. She asked to speak with him directly on day 51. This in itself was remarkable. Labor units did not request audiences with overseers. The chain of authority moved in one direction, downward, and the architecture of the ship was literally designed to maintain that flow. Labor units petitioned to their supervisory clerks. Clerks escalated to section commanders to overseers. Maren Coyle sent a written request, on maintenance log parchment, directly to Drath Vel's personal administrative queue, addressed correctly, in the formal register of Veth hierarchical addressed to Overseer Drath Vel of the 3rd Supervisory Ring, Dominion of Correct Order, with a notation in the bottom corner that said, in the translated frequency, I believe this matter is appropriate for overseer-level attention. I think you know why. He read it 3 times. He noticed she'd spelled his name right. Veth names had 7 tonal components and most acquired species mangled them badly for the first year. He noticed she'd used the formal register correctly, which meant she'd either studied Veth protocol on her own or had gotten someone to teach her, and both possibilities implied a degree of intentionality that the back of his neck, or whatever the Veth anatomical equivalent was, registered as something between admiration and alarm. He granted the audience. She came in wearing her maintenance coverall, compliance band on her wrist glinting in the overhead biolights. Hair. Humans had hair, great amounts of it, a feature Drath Vel had never quite gotten used to. Pulled back in a tight, practical knot. She sat in the chair across his desk without being invited to, which should have irritated him and somehow didn't. Overseer, she said. Acquisition Coyle. He let a beat go. You requested this meeting. That is unusual. I know. She folded her hands on the desk. Those hands again, that same quality of practiced stillness. I want to request a formal modification to the Environmental Maintenance Division workflow. Your supervisory clerk is the appropriate channel for workflow requests. Ashvel is competent, she said, but the modification I'm proposing affects his reporting authority, and I don't think he's going to submit it accurately, because it makes him nervous, so I'm bringing it to you directly. A pause. You have been watching my section, not a question. Drath Vel said carefully. Oversight is a standard component of POB. You have been watching me specifically, she said, and there was nothing confrontational in it, no challenge, just the same calm certainty she'd brought to the distribution corridor when she'd said Peldor's name. That's fine, I'd have done the same thing. She pulled a folded piece of parchment from her coverall pocket and smoothed it out on his desk. The 3rd loop, the one Ashvel didn't implement. He looked at the parchment. She'd been working on it. The original sketch he'd seen in Ashvel's report had been expanded, annotated, cross-referenced with efficiency data from the last 60 days, projected impact modeled out across 4 duty cycles. It was, he realized with a slow, cold certainty, the work of someone who understood not just the workflow she'd been assigned, but the broader administrative architecture it fed into. She understood the ship, not as a labor unit understands her assigned section, but the way a commander understands a vessel. This modification, she said, would save 11 hours of collective labor per cycle across 3 divisions, improve filtration response time by an average of 22%, and reduce the rate of compliance corrections issued in Sections 7 through 12 by approximately 40%. She paused. The compliance correction reduction matters. Correction events correlate with elevated physiological stress indicators in the labor units, and elevated stress indicators correlate with a 14% increase in error rates over the following 12 hours. So the corrections are actually making the work worse. Silence. You have run the correlation yourself, Drathvel said. It was not a question either. With Tessel's help, he did the math. He's very good at it. He used to be an engineer. Before. She didn't elaborate on the before, and he didn't ask, and there was something in the mutual non-asking that felt like an agreement of a different kind. I want to implement the full modification. I need your authorization because it crosses divisional lines. Drathvel looked at the parchment. He looked at her hands. He looked at the compliance band on her wrist, which had not fired a correction in 51 days, which was sitting on her arm like a thing that had forgotten it was supposed to be a restraint. He thought about the behavioral file. Hierarchical inversion tendency. He thought about the 43 species the compliance architecture had successfully managed. He thought about the way she'd said, "I believe this matter is appropriate for overseer-level attention. I think you know why." She'd told him. In that line, she'd told him exactly what she was doing, which meant she wasn't afraid of him knowing, which meant she'd already calculated that his knowing it wouldn't stop her, which meant either she was extraordinarily arrogant or she understood him better than he was entirely comfortable with. He looked at her. She looked back with those forward-facing eyes, that wet, startled light. "I will review the proposal," he said, "and submit it to the section commander for consideration." Something in her, not quite a smile, more the suggestion of one, the ghost of it at the corner of her mouth. "Thank you, Overseer." She stood, folded her hands, and left. Drathvel sat alone in his office for a long time. The starlight came in through the viewport. He thought about the word command, its shape in Veth linguistic structures, the weight it carried, the absolute clarity of it. You command, others obey, the architecture of correct order. He thought about the way she'd walked in without being invited to sit, and sat, and presented her case, and thanked him at the end, and how the entire exchange had felt, despite everything, despite the compliance band, and the uniforms, and the manifest, and every structural reality of the dominion of correct order, like he'd just been conducted. He pressed his secondary crest flat. He started reading the proposal. The section commander's name was Vorsheth, and he had held the position for 11 years, which was long enough to make him confident and not quite long enough to make him wise. A distinction that Drathvel, who had known a great number of both types, considered privately significant. Vorsheth was not a bad administrator. He maintained productivity metrics within acceptable ranges, managed his clerks with a firm hand, and had an instinct for delegation that Drathvel sometimes envied. What he lacked, and what Drathvel had spent 3 days trying to decide whether to compensate for, was a working vocabulary for things that didn't fit the architecture. Drathvel submitted the workflow modification proposal with his personal endorsement and a notation that read, in the formal register, "Analysis demonstrates substantial efficiency gains across multiple operational parameters. Recommend implementation pending command review." He did not mention where the proposal had originated. Ashvel's name was on the paperwork. As the supervisory clerk of record for the division, Maren Coyle's name was not. He told himself this was because attribution in labor unit workflow suggestions was not standard protocol. He was not sure he believed himself. Vorsheth approved the modification in 48 hours without requesting elaboration. The efficiency gains were real. They were measurable. They were the kind of numbers that looked good in quarterly reports, and Vorsheth had in 11 years developed a reliable affection for numbers that looked good in quarterly reports. He submitted the implementation order. The Environmental Maintenance Division workflow was restructured. The third loop was eliminated. On the first day of the new workflow, compliance corrections in sections 7 through 12 dropped by 38%. On the second day, a Kethar unit in Mechanical Repair Division 3, whose section shared monitoring infrastructure with the newly restructured environmental maintenance workflow, noticed an inefficiency in his own section's diagnostic protocol and mentioned it not to his supervisory clerk, which was the proper channel, but to Maren Coyle, whom he'd been talking to in the distribution corridor for 3 weeks. She listened, asked 3 questions, and suggested he document it and bring it up the chain. He did. The improvement was implemented. His supervisory clerk received a notation. The Gorlan named Teller quietly modeled a different approach to atmospheric scrubber maintenance that would extend equipment life by approximately 15%. He gave the documentation to Maren Coyle. She handed it to Ashvel. Ashvel passed it upward. None of this was coordinated, or that was the thing, wasn't it? It wasn't coordinated the way a rebellion is coordinated, with meetings and signals and a chain of command running counter to the official one. It was coordinated the way a river is coordinated. Not by plan, but by the shape of the land, by the orientation of everything toward the lowest point, except in this case, the lowest point was something more like the most useful point, the place where energy wanted to go if you stopped blocking it. Drathvel watched it happen over 4 weeks and felt, with increasing specificity, like a man standing in a river that has not yet decided to flood. The thing that finally made him act, if you could call it acting, given that what he did was conspicuously refrain from doing anything, was a conversation he overheard in Corridor 7, on a morning when he was conducting a routine walkthrough, and came around a corner earlier than expected. Maren Coyle was talking to 3 labor units he didn't immediately recognize. 2 Kethar and an older Primath who turned out, when he checked later, to be from Mechanical Division 3. Not her section, not her division, not her authorized movement zone. Technically, though the morning rest interval gave a 30-minute radius and she was within it by 11 minutes, she was saying don't petition it as a complaint. Frame it as an efficiency concern and attach the numbers. If the numbers are right, they have to look at it. One of the Kethar said something he didn't catch. Because, she said, with that particular quality of patience that people have when they have thought about something for a long time and they are being careful to give it the right shape, the architecture here isn't set up to ignore good numbers. That's the thing they got right. They built the system to respond to productivity. So you use the system. A pause. You give them what they said they wanted, and you make sure that what they said they wanted is actually what you want too. That's not deception. That's just, she stopped, appeared to search for the right word, made a small gesture with one hand. Translation. Translation. Drathvel stood around the corner for a moment. He wouldn't have admitted to later. Secondary crest, absolutely level with the kind of effort that had become over 6 weeks of persistent low-grade exercise. He went back to his office. He sat down. He pulled up the behavioral file for the 47th time. H-sapiens demonstrate a behavioral pattern classified by xenopsychologists as hierarchical inversion tendency. He read the whole thing this time, very carefully, down to the footnotes. There were footnotes, there were always footnotes. The academics put the real stuff in the footnotes, and in the 3rd footnote on the 2nd page, he found a citation to a secondary study conducted on a human research station before the annexation, by a xenopsychologist named Veth. Veth, interestingly, though a different family line, who had spent 4 years embedded with a human academic institution and written an 800-page monograph that the collective's administrative division had classified as Level 2 academic interest, which meant it existed, had been filed, and had never once been read by anyone whose job it was to actually manage human labor units. He pulled the monograph. He started reading. By the time he finished 2 days later, reading in the early morning hours with the stimulant tea and the starlight, something had shifted in his understanding of the situation that he couldn't quite shift back. The monograph's central argument, stated in the careful hedged language of academic scholarship but pointed as a surgical instrument if you were paying attention, was this: humans did not evolve a compliance instinct. They evolved something that looked like compliance but was functionally different, what Veth called adaptive voluntary cooperation, a capacity to accept authority structures provisionally, instrumentally, as long as those structures served a goal the individual found meaningful. The compliance was real, but it was a strategy, not an instinct. And strategies, this was the part that had kept him awake for 2 days. Strategies can be redirected. Strategies choose their own terrain. A human under command, Veth had written, in a passage that Drathvel read 4 times, does not experience the command as a ceiling. The human experiences the command as a floor. They stand on it and build upward. He closed the monograph. He sat in the dark. He thought about Maren Coyle walking into his office without being invited to sit, and sitting, and presenting numbers that were correct, and thanking him at the end. He thought about the word translation. He thought about a woman who'd had a compliance band fitted to her wrist in a processing corridor and had held her hands in that way, thumbs inward, fingers loose, and who had not, in 59 days, had a single correction issued. Not because she was obeying, because she had made obedience irrelevant. The crisis, if you want to call it that, and Drath Vel went back and forth on the word for a long time afterward, happened in week 9. The proximate cause was a labor unit in Mechanical Division 2 named Char Rose, a species Drath Vel had never learned to keep straight, four-limbed but structured differently than humans. A pinkish-gray integument that bruised badly. Char Rose had been assigned a maintenance task requiring access to a panel in Section 9 that was, per the hull integrity logs, borderline compromised. Not critically, not immediately dangerous, but the kind of borderline that careful engineers look at and suggest deferring until proper shielding can be arranged. The supervisory clerk for Mechanical Division 2 was not careful. He was also in the way of certain Veth who had served long enough to mistake familiarity for authority, not particularly interested in input from labor units. He issued the directive. Char Ross was sent to Section 9. Maren Coyle was running her morning inspection sweep in Section 9 when this happened. She saw Char Ross arrive with tools. She asked what the assignment was. She looked at the panel. She looked at the hull integrity reading on her handheld monitor, the one Ashvel had approved her having after the workflow modification went through, because someone needed to carry it during sweeps and she was the most reliable sweep runner they had. She checked the reading against the safety threshold protocols in the maintenance manual, which she apparently had memorized, or near enough. The panel was 0.37 below the safety threshold. Not catastrophically, but enough. She told Char Ross to wait. What? She walked back up the corridor to the nearest terminal, opened a priority maintenance flag, documented the hull reading, the safety threshold, the deviation and the assigned task in a formal incident report, and routed it simultaneously to Ashvel, the Mechanical Division 2 supervisory clerk, Vorshosheth, and because she understood, by this point, exactly who was watching Drath Vel. The whole thing took her 8 minutes. Drath Vel received the notification on his personal console while he was in a briefing with 2 other overseers about fuel allocation. He excused himself. He read it. He immediately flagged the Section 9 assignment for suspension and sent a directive to Mechanical Division 2 to halt work pending safety review. He then had to spend 45 minutes on a comm with a very irritated Mechanical Division 2 section commander named Harvel, who felt that his operational authority had been undermined by an overseer sticking his crest into another section's assignments. The integrity reading is documented in the report, Drath Vel said, for the 3rd time. The reading is within operational range. Well, the reading is 0.37 below threshold. If you'd like, I can pull the hull stress projections from the last 8 cycle months and show you the decay rate. A pause. You have those projections. The labor unit who filed the report included them. Drath Vel looked at the incident report on his screen. She'd attached 4 pages of data. 4 pages, 8 minutes. Yes, I have the projections. The work was suspended. The panel was shored up over the following 2 days. Char Ross was unharmed. The incident was noted in the divisional log as a proactive safety intervention, and nobody above Harvel's level ever heard about it, which was exactly how these things were handled when an administrator made a borderline call that turned out to be wrong. Maren Coyle received a performance notation from Ashvel, initiative consistent with elevated task classification, safety protocol adherence exemplary. She also received, for the first time since her intake, a compliance band correction issued by Mechanical Division 2's supervisory clerk, on the grounds that she had interfered with an authorized directive. 1 second. Just enough to register. Drath Vel found out because the incident reporting system logged all corrections. He sat with that knowledge for a while. He thought about what it meant that someone had needed to correct her, not for failing to obey, but for knowing too much, for making the right call too publicly, in a way that made someone else's wrong call visible. He thought about what it meant that the correction had been the response to competence. He wrote a very careful, very formal note to Mechanical Division 2's supervisory clerk, documenting the facts of the incident, the safety threshold deviation, the validity of the flagged report, and concluding with a line that said in the formal register, precisely, so there would be no ambiguity. Compliance corrections issued in response to accurate and timely safety reporting are noted as inconsistent with productivity optimization protocols and will be flagged accordingly on future performance reviews. He sent it. He went back to his office. He stood at the viewport for a long time. He'd gone to bat for her. He'd done it formally, on the record, in a way that aligned with every piece of Veth administrative protocol, and could not be characterized as anything other than correct overseer procedure. He'd also done it in a way that required him to stop pretending he wasn't watching, Stop pretending there was no particular labor unit in Environmental Maintenance Division 7 that had reorganized his understanding of his own ship from the inside out. He thought about the word she'd used. Translation. He thought about Veth's footnotes. They stand on it and build upward. He thought about 43 species and compliance bands, and the phrase hierarchical inevitability, which the collective printed in the administrative manual in the large font reserved for foundational principles, which he had believed, without serious examination, for 31 years. He thought about how command worked in Veth, the phonological components of it. Doroth, which carried in its etymology the concept of a downward force, a pressing weight, the architecture of compulsion. He thought about what it would mean to stand under that weight and decide not to fight it, not to flee it, but to use it, to press back upward through the exact channels it had created, to make the system justify you. He requested a second meeting with her on day 63. She came in again without being invited to sat. This time she had a cup of something. The human hot beverage preparation ritual was a thing. Labor units had arranged for themselves using the kitchen adjacent to Dormitory B, which was technically a personal use of galley resources that fell into a gray area of the operational guidelines, and which Drathvel had flagged as low priority for 3 weeks and then quietly removed from his monitoring queue. She set the cup on his desk. Steam curled up between them. He said without preamble, "I have been reviewing the productivity impact reports for the last 9 weeks, and the divisions where your workflow modifications have been implemented have seen aggregate efficiency improvements of 19%. Compliance correction rates have dropped across 3 sections. A safety incident in Mechanical 2 was prevented." He paused. "The labor unit population in sections adjacent to your assignment area demonstrates measurably lower physiological stress indicators than the ship-wide baseline." She looked at him, said nothing. "I have also," he said, "read the Veth monograph." Something moved across her face. Quick, real. The involuntary reflex of a person who has been understood and wasn't entirely prepared for it. She picked up the cup, set it back down without drinking. "I want to ask you something," Drathvel said, "and I want you to answer honestly, which I suspect you will do regardless, because I don't think you lie about things that matter." She waited. "Were you planning this? From intake?" She was quiet for a moment. The starlight came in sideways through the viewport. "Not exactly," she said. I mean you don't grow up human without knowing how authority tends to work, how it gets fragile in certain conditions. I knew if I was going to survive here for any length of time, I needed it to be worth something. My being here, not just for me." She turned the cup in her hands. "The thing about the compliance band is that it corrects you when you go outside the parameters. So I stayed inside the parameters, and I moved the parameters. You used the architecture against itself. I used the architecture for what it said it wanted." She looked up. "You want productivity. I gave you productivity. You want efficiency. I gave you efficiency. The band never fired because I never disobeyed. Not once." A pause. "I just made obedience useful." Drathvel looked at the compliance band on her wrist, the glinting alloy of it. The Veth engineers who designed it had been proud of it, an elegant solution to the management problem of acquired species. Neurological guidance without permanent damage, correction without cruelty. They had built it to enforce compliance. They had, it turned out, not quite understood what compliance could be made to mean. He said, "What would you do if you could do anything with the authority you have built in this ship?" She looked at him for a long time. He had the impression strange for a Veth. Strange full stop of being assessed by something patient and thorough and not unkind. "I'd make it a better ship," she said, "which would make it more valuable to you. Which is the part where your interests and mine overlap enough to be interesting." She set down the cup. "I don't want to run your ship, Overseer. I want the labor units in it to stop being afraid of the buzzing on their wrists. I want the engineers to be able to report a compromised panel without it being someone's political problem. I want Tella to keep doing the math because he's excellent at it, and you are wasting him on scrubbers. A beat. I want to be useful, not obedient. Those are different things." Drathvel was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the stimulant tea on his own desk went cold. "Yes," he said, "they are." He reached across the desk. He pulled a form from the administrative stack. The form for voluntary compliance architecture suspension, which existed in the protocol manual and had never in his 9 cycles of service been used. You could suspend a compliance band if the labor unit could demonstrate sustained voluntary cooperation, and if the overseer of record was willing to stake his own performance review on it. It was a procedure for edge cases. It was a procedure someone had put in the manual because they'd imagined once that an edge case might come along. He slid it across the desk. She looked at it. She looked at him. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She picked up the stylus from the corner of his desk. Her stylus, he realized. She'd apparently left it here after the last meeting. Just set it there casually like she owned a piece of his office already. And she signed. Her name in the human script which he'd been learning slightly in the early morning hours before his reports, because it seemed like something he should understand. He countersigned. He submitted the form. Somewhere in the ship's administrative system, the compliance band on Maren Coyle's wrist registered its own suspension, the tiny internal mechanism going quiet. She touched it with 2 fingers, a small gesture. "Private." Then she stood up, tucked the stylus into her pocket, and said, not exactly warmly, but with that quality she had of meaning exactly what she said, and nothing more, nothing less, "Thank you, Overseer. Drath Vel," he said. All 7 tonal components, the way it was supposed to be pronounced. A beta. "Thank you, Drath Vel," she said. She left. He sat in the office for a long while after. The starlight came in through the viewport, old light from a long way off, arriving after its source had already moved on. He thought about 43 species. He thought about the 44th. He thought about a woman who'd walked into a processing corridor with her thumbs tucked inward and her fingers loose, who'd looked at a compliance band and seen not a ceiling but a floor, and had spent 63 days building something on it that the architects of the band had never once imagined. He thought about command. Doroth. The downward press. The weight of authority. He thought about what happens when something pressed down is not crushed but compressed, when it learns the shape of the force applied to it and finds in that shape the exact geometry needed to push back up. He thought, they told us she would obey. He thought, she did. And somehow that was the most terrifying and most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed in 31 years of service, because she had obeyed every single directive and rewritten, in doing so, what obedience was capable of, what command could be made by someone patient enough and clear-eyed enough to mean. He opened a new file on his console. He started writing. Not a report, not a flag. Something longer, more considered, the kind of document that lives in footnotes. In the 3rd footnote of the 2nd page, where only the people who are really paying attention think to look. He titled it, Observations on Voluntary Cooperation in H. Sapiens, a Field Revision. He wrote for 3 hours. Outside, in the corridors of the Dominion of Correct Order, Maren Coyle walked back to Environmental Maintenance Division 7 with her hands loose at her sides, compliance band silent on her wrist, and somewhere in Section 9 Tel the Gorlan, who had not spoken to anyone for 8 months before she arrived, who had been an engineer once, who was excellent at the math, was already working on something new,